All right, this point here on the creationism versus evolution, evidence of massive movements in the Earth's crust. We started, and let's go to that. K29.htm. Evidence of massive movements in the Earth's crust cannot be explained by uniformitarianism. We've exploded that multiple times because of volcanic activity, earthquake activity, and now evidence of massive movements in the Earth's crust. Based on predictable rates of erosion, mountain ranges such as the Rocky Mountains should not exist today if you go back millions of years. Why? Okay, maybe catastrophic. Another major geologic phenomena encountered all over the world is the evidence of tremendous crustal movements, the Earth's crust, that must have occurred in the past. Great thicknesses of rocks have apparently been uplifted thousands of feet. Strata have buckled, folded, sometimes been thrust laterally, or completely overturned on a gigantic scale. How about it that happened cataclysmically? Not in the past, except at the one-time event of worldwide flood. The Great Rocky Mountain chain, especially as developed in the southern Rockies, is essentially a series of great folds. In the eastern part of this country, the Appalachian system of mountains is believed to be the uplifted and eroded remnant of great geosynclinal trough, in which a thickness of some 40,000 feet of sedimentary rocks were deposited. These mountains reveal a very involved assortment of gigantic faults, folds, and thrusts. Similar phenomena are found in every region of the world. The crust of the Earth seems to have been distorted, fractured, elevated, depressed, and contorted in almost every conceivable way at some time or times in the past. How about just one time? This is further attested to by the great areas of metamorphosis in which the original sedimentary of crystalline rocks, they have been completely changed in form as a result of the gigantic stresses acting in the crust. Schistosity. Well, I took the look at the dictionary. Great changes resulting in parallel splitting in crystalline rocks is also attributed to these causes. Catastrophic. Nor are these phenomena, which are too familiar to everyone even to require documentation, limited to the land surfaces. It was once supposed that the deep oceans had remained dark, lifeless, and unchanged, save for the finest rain of sediment since the world began. But the new knowledge has quite dispelled this view. Across the ocean floor, geophysicists have now traced great fractures, scarps, and rifts, have found scattered volcanic peaks and ranges, and have charted canyons cut by slumps and flows of mud on the continental margins. Uniformitarianism? How about a cataclysmic flood? Another reference I have here. Most, if not all, of these diastrophic features, geologic deformations of the Earth's crust, are believed to be associated with orogenies, processes of mountain forming, that is, periods of mountain building. The most conspicuous and perhaps also the most significant structural features of the face of the Earth are the great belts of folded mountains like those of the Himalayas, Andes, Urals, and Appalachians, and the so-called orogenic belts. Along these long and relatively narrow zones, great thicknesses of dominantly marine sediments have been squeezed together and thrust upon the other to form highly elongated folds with axes essentially parallel to that of the belt. A worldwide flood would do that. Over the ages, not explained. It is here that the principle of uniformity would appear to be most inadequate. If it were valid, surely a feature of such prime importance in the interpretation of Earth history as diastrophism and orogeny should be explainable in terms of some sort of present-day observable and measurable process which is now producing incipient Earth movements of similar kind. But so far is this far from being the case. The case that geologists are still utterly unable to agree on even a satisfactory hypothesis of mountain building. Not over the years. Adams of Carnegie Institute said some years ago in his retiring address as president of the American Geophysical Union concerning these problems, of orogeny? Many attempts to answer these questions have engaged the attention of the best minds, but the existing answers leave much to be desired. Complicated mechanisms in great variety have been adduced, but in all instances, cogent objections have been raised. Keep sticking to the one point. Oh, it's got to happen over a period of ages. Can't admit a worldwide flood. Some unsolved problems of geophysics. All of this, again, bears very heavily against the notions of uniformity. Furthermore, these orogenic processes cannot be shoved back into the dim recesses of early terrestrial history, but must be very recently have been immensely potent. All the major mountain ranges of the present world evidently were uplifted within the most recent eras of geologic history. It has already been pointed out by evolutionists that fossil evidence indicates most of the great mountain chains date from the supposed earlier ages, Pleistocene or late Pliocene, are the earliest. The geologic and archaeologic chronologies of the fossil beds, which have yielded remains and artifacts of human beings, likewise date in many instances from the Pleistocene and even perhaps the Pliocene, because humans weren't around then, according to years ago, really? After considering all the human fossil evidence, Zuner concludes as one point is apparent from the table that the evolution of Homo, or humans, is not entirely confined to the Pleistocene. We find that definitely the Pithecanthropus group in the lower Pleistocene, and there is some suggestive evidence for the sapien stock going back to this time. Wow. If this proves to be true, the Homo stock as a whole must date from well within the Pliocene. Still undecided. Of course, we are not subscribing to the evolutionary interpretation of these evidences, but it is significant that the geologic and paleontologic data seem to prove that man lived during the times when deposits were being laid down which were now found capping the mountains, and thus that the mountain ranges making process with all their associated phenomena, the faults, rifts, and so on, have been active within geologically very recent times. But they are not active now, at least not measurably so. And yet the processes associated with mountain building and the results are considered by all geophysicists and geomorphologists to be absolutely basic to the interpretation of Earth history. Here then is another extremely important gap in the range of applicability of the so-called law of uniformity, whereby present processes are supposed to suffice to explain all geological phenomena, and they can't unless there's a worldwide flood. All right. Stumbled on a lot of words there. Hard in the morning. We go to unprecedented sedimentary activity points to a worldwide flood as well. The unprecedented sedimentary activity resulting from the worldwide flood is what is responsible for nearly all of today's geological formations and of its fossils. This gets closer to home. How old are the rocks? As old as the fossils. How old are the fossils? As old as the rock. Or maybe it's recent, today's geological formations, and its fossils were formed perhaps very, very recently, like a worldwide flood. Many times the sedimentary deposits are said to be explainable only in terms of long periods of time. It is natural to think that with great thicknesses of water and laid rock beds, perhaps thousands of feet thick, it must have taken ages for this to form. But this is reckoning in uniformitarian terms. He completely ruled out consideration of a worldwide flood or even a recent flood? No. It is not difficult to see how they could have been formed in a short period if the aqueous and sedimentary activity were intense enough, as it undoubtedly was during the deluge. With an abundance of organic matter available, not to mention water, it is thus obvious that conditions after the deluge would be highly favorable to rapid initiation of diagenetic recombination processes with resultant early lithification, rock formation. The so-called mysteries of sedimentary formations could be resolved if they were approached not on the basis of uniformitarianism or uniformity with present processes, but were envisioned in terms of rapid deposition of great masses of sediments mixed with various chemicals and organic matter. Deluge conditions quite obviously afford an ample source of silica, calcite, and other cementing materials. Fossils, instant fossils, like instant coffee, came along. The problem of lithification of sediments is therefore not at all a serious one for biblical geology. Rather, it is highly consonant with the whole character of the catastrophic action attending deposition of the deluged sediments to infer the processes of compaction, sedimentation, drying, etc., leading to final lithification, which could have been accomplished quite rapidly. The entire account of the flood in Scripture plainly yields the inference that tremendous quantities of earth and rock must have been excavated by the waters of the flood. Many factors must have contributed to this: the driving rains, the raging streams resulting from them, the earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, the powerful tidal waves, and then later the waves and other currents generated by the rising of the lands and sinking of the basins, and perhaps many other factors which we cannot now even guess. Suppose never since the world was formed could there ever have been such extensive erosion of soil and rock beds on a global scale as during the Genesis flood. And guess what? When the flood comes, all the previous actions and activities over the ages, if there were one, would be erased. If there were, but there weren't. And the materials that were eroded must eventually have been redeposited somewhere, and necessarily in stratified layers, such as we find everywhere around the world today in the great sedimentary rock systems, which are never precisely the same wherever you go. So the ages are different wherever the world goes, so maybe there weren't a lot of different ages. The picture then is of an awesome proportions. The vast waters above the firmament poured forth through what we are graphically representing in the Scriptures as the floodgates of heaven, swelling the rivers and waterways and initiating the erosion and transportation of vast inland sediments. At the same time, waters and probably magmas were bursting up through the fractured fountains of the great subterranean deep. Volcanoes, earthquakes, I don't know how anybody would have survived, and they didn't, except for the 8 in the ark. In the seas, these fountains were not only belched forth their waters and volcanic materials, but the corresponding earth displacements must have been continually generating powerful tsunamis, which are volcanic earthquake-induced great tidal waves, 100 feet tall, powerful, 500 miles an hour. Wow. The tremendous complex of forces, diastrophic relative to deformations, earthquakes, volcanoes, and hydrodynamic relative to fluid motion mechanics must, beyond any question, have profoundly altered the antediluvian topography and geology of the Earth's crust. Powerful currents of all directions and magnitudes and periods must have been generated and made to function as agents of immense eroding, transporting, and depositional potency. Under the action of this combination of effects, almost any sort of deposit or depositional sequence becomes possible and plausible. Plausibility of the worldwide flood, here it is. An immense variety of sediments must finally have been the result after the flood had run its course. So the sediments that we see today produced by the worldwide flood in less than a year, not in billions of years. And yet, in spite of the complexity of physical agencies involved in the resulting variety of formations and sediments, certain general semblances of order might be anticipated in the deposits when the waters abated. The creatures of the deep sea bottoms would universally be overwhelmed by the toxicity and the violence of the volcanic emanations and the bottom currents generated thereby, and would in general be mixed with inorganic materials and simultaneously dislodged from the bed, transported, and eventually redeposited on the bed in the form of fossils. In similar fashion, the fish and other organisms living nearer the surface would subsequently be entrapped by either materials washing down the land surface of the water, coastal sea bottoms, or by materials upwelling from the depths. Again, these sediments would be transported and redeposited either on the sea bottom or occasionally on top of other sediments having already laid down. On the land, the raging rivers would carry great quantities of detritus seawater, detritus, eroded away matter, occasionally entombing animals or reptiles, together with great rifts of vegetation. These would normally be deposited finally in some more or less quiescent, quiet reach of stream, or finally in the sea on top of other deposits, or perhaps on the exposed bottom itself. As far as land and animals and man are concerned, their greater mobility would have enabled most of them to escape temporarily to higher ground as the waters rose, only occasionally individuals being swept away and entombed in the sediments. They eventually would have drowned. More on this next time.